like and subscribe, and leave a comment below. Beyond Antarctica, Chapter 27. The cell trembled violently as the ground beneath them shook, with the tremors growing stronger with each passing second. The lights flickered above, casting shadows that danced across the metallic walls. Kim stumbled, with her balance thrown off by the unexpected quake, but John, moving with a speed that belied his age, caught her just in time, saving her from a potentially nasty fall. He steadied her, but as he looked up, his eyes met Bob's and Tony's, both filled with the same fearful realization. They were running out of time. As the tremors subsided, the crew exchanged stories, each more unsettling than the last. The weight of their desperate situation settled over them like a heavy fog, thick and suffocating. John, usually so composed, began to pace the small confines of the cell, his mind racing but finding no solutions. "I'm left without a plan," he admitted, with his voice carrying the heavy burden of a man who was used to having answers. Tony interrupted. "If we can get our stuff, I think we can get out of here, other than a few guards along the way, which, I remind you, are just children. I'm confident we can make it to the Crystal Cave. From there, we should be able to find a route back to the surface. Once we're topside, it's just a matter of getting to the coastline." Todd nodded, with his mind already mapping out the escape. "It shouldn't be that difficult. We've navigated worse before." But Kim wasn't ready to concede so easily. "We can't just leave," she says. "This so-called AI, Hope, has enslaved these people, brainwashing and conditioning them from birth into this way of life. The key letters in culture you must watch out for is cult." She takes a moment for her words to sink in, then continues. "It's acting like a god, forcing most of the population into the mines for its survival. It's far beyond its original programming now. We need to help them. No human should be enslaved, especially not by a machine that's turned into a cult leader. They could have moved to the surface long ago and learned to survive again, but Hope, it has a different agenda now. It's fulfilling its programming, the survival of humanity, but in a twisted way that wasn't intended by its creators." John stopped pacing and faced her. "Kim, I remind you, we don't know the true numbers in this facility. We don't have a real game plan to save ourselves, let alone these people, and you're talking about saving the world again." Kim's eyes hardened. "Dad, did you see the faces of those children in the mines?" She tore a strip from her shirt, wrapping it tightly around her bleeding, blistered hands. She grunted as she secured the makeshift bandage, then stood, looking her father in the eye. "When they come to get us, I'm not going quietly into the night. I can tell you that right now." Bob stepped forward, placing a comforting hand on Kim's shoulder. As he unbuckled his belt, he spoke softly. "Let's see if we can get free before it comes to that, hun. But your father's right, Kim. This isn't our fight. As much as I hate to say it, we should just move on. There are too many variables, too many unknowns." Murmurs of agreement echoed around the cell, but Kim looked around in disgust. "You all value your own lives more than those children." Bob sighed, his voice heavy with the harsh reality. "No, Kim, that's a quantum supercomputer we're dealing with, one that's calculated every possible move we could make. That's why we're to be executed." Kim lowered her head. "Yeah, I guess you're right. It's thought this out 1 billion times and double-checked its calculations. We should do nothing." Then she raised her head and looked Bob square in the eyes. "But there's one thing it didn't factor into its equations, and that's the tenacity of the crew of the Celeb Mariner." John chuckled with a wry smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. The pride he had for Kim's humanity was evident. "All right, see what you can do about reaching our gear first." He handed Bob his belt buckle. That was in the shape of an anchor. "See if you can use this as a makeshift hook," John said. But before Bob could make a move, the ground shook violently again, this time with an intensity that sent shock waves through the facility. The lights flickered once, twice, and then went out completely, plunging them into a suffocating darkness. For a moment, the crew stood frozen. You could hear their hearts pounding in the silence that followed. Then, faintly, the walls began to glow with a dim, pulsing light. Bob says, "That's not good. I think we just lost power." and the walls glowing as a form of emergency lighting. The dim, pulsing light bathed the cell in a greenish glow. John hesitated for a moment, then reached out toward the metal bars, expecting the familiar jolt of electricity. To his amazement, the shock never came. As his hand met the cold steel, "It's not electrified anymore," he whispered, testing the bars again just to be sure. He quickly moved to the cell door, but a quick push confirmed it was still securely locked. John's mind raced with possibilities. "We might be able to get out of here," he said, turning to the others, "but we need our gear." Bob grabbed Tony's belt and began linking it to his own and John's. He tossed the combined belts toward the table where their belongings were tantalizingly close but still frustratingly out of reach. The belts fell short, dangling 3 feet from the table's edge. Bob frowned, shaking his head. "John, I don't think even with your belt we can reach it. We're way too short." John glanced around the cell with his eyes settling on their clothes. "Maybe if we tie a couple of our shirts together, we can extend the reach. We just need to hook my coat and backpack." Without hesitation, Todd and Tony stripped off their shirts, handing them over to Bob. He quickly tied the shirts together, adding the extra length needed. With a careful aim, Bob tossed the makeshift line again. This time it landed squarely in the center of their pile of gear. He pulled gently as it dragged half of their stuff onto the cold metallic floor with a resounding thud that echoed through the cell. Kim's eyes darted to the edge of the table. "There! The shotgun is just hanging off the table. I think you can hook it now and drag it closer." John immediately interjected, shaking his head. "Kim, we're not blasting our way through this door. We need my coat first, then my backpack. If you can hook them both, they're right there on the floor, Bob." As he points, Bob nodded, squinting to see through the dim light. "Yeah, I see it." He tossed the line once more, this time hooking onto John's leather coat. As he carefully pulled, the coat slid closer, but with every tug, the stitches groaned under the strain, tearing slightly. John winced, feeling the pain of each stitch ripping as if it were his own flesh. "Bob, be careful. My wife gave that to me," he urged. The sentiment in his voice was clear. Bob glanced over, with guilt in his eyes. "Ouch. Sorry, John, but it is what it is, old friend." He continued to pull slowly, finally managing to drag the coat into the cell, but the backpack slid off the coat halfway to the cell. Handing John his coat, Bob prepared to make another attempt. For the backpack, John couldn't help but chuckle. "Just like when we go fishing, Bob. You always seem to lose half our catch." He put his coat on and stretched out, savoring the familiar comfort before reaching into the inside pocket, pulling out his flask. Kim's eyes narrowed, her voice cutting through the air like a whip. "Oh, hell no. You didn't just have him get your coat so you could take a shot." The anger in her tone was sharp enough to make even Bob lower his head in shame. John looked at her, genuinely surprised by her accusation. He shook his head and reached back into the pocket, this time pulling out a small pocket knife and slipping the flask back. He moved to the cell door, using the knife to pry at the panel covering the locking mechanism. The metal groaned as it began to give way. Bob, meanwhile, tossed the makeshift line again, successfully dragging the backpack into the cell this time. He handed it to John, who immediately dug through it, pulling out a small tent stake and a mallet. Using the mallet, he hammered the stake into the small opening he had pried open with the knife, creating enough space to wedge the knife inside. "Bob, put some muscle into this, will ya?" John instructed, holding the knife steady. Bob laughed. "Yeah, I got you, John." He grabbed the tent stake and pried with all his might. The panel bent open, exposing the inner workings of the lock. John leaned in, examining the complex mechanisms. It was a mess of gears, springs, and pins. At a glance, he knew it was beyond his skill to unlock. He handed the knife to Todd. "Your turn, Todd. See what you can do." Todd nodded, his hand steady as he worked the knife into the mechanism, probing carefully until he found the right spot. With a precise flick of his wrist, he pried at a hidden pin inside the lock. The pin clicked into place with a loud, satisfying snap, and the cell door creaked open. The sound was like music to their ears. They all exchanged looks of relief, but as they prepared to step out of the cell, the ground beneath them trembled violently once more, the lights flickering out entirely, plunging them into an oppressive darkness. Moments later, the walls started to glow once again, as Todd carefully jimmied the knife into the slit of the room door. With a steady hand, he pried it open, the metal groaning softly before the door finally gave way, revealing an empty hallway bathed in the same faint pulsing glow. Their relief was short-lived, though, as the unmistakable sound of rustling footsteps echoed down the corridor, growing louder with each passing second. John's heart raced as he exchanged a glance with the others. "Grab our stuff," he yelled, with the urgency of their situation crystal clear. "We've got company," he shouted, with the words hanging in the air like a warning bell. There was no turning back now. Whatever was coming was going to be there in moments. They had to hurry if they had a chance of escape. "This way," John barked, taking charge as they bolted down the corridor. With the sound of approaching footsteps echoing off the metallic walls, the hallway stretched out before them like a labyrinth, with the faint pulsing lights casting blurred shadows on the floors as they ran. Bob took up the rear, his head swiveling to keep an eye on the encroaching danger. The ominous rustle of footsteps grew louder behind them, a tide of bodies closing in fast. John's grip tightened on Kim's wrist, yanking her closer. In one swift motion, he shoved a pistol into her trembling hand. He turned on her with his eyes blazing with a fierce, desperate intensity. "Children or no children, I expect you to go out shooting. Do you understand me, love?" His voice was harsh, laced with the fear that he couldn't afford to show the crew. Kim lowered her head, with the weight of his words sinking in. "Yes, Father," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I will not be taken, just to be assassinated later. You have my word." Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them away, steeling herself for what was to come. John released her wrist, his face softening for just a moment as he turned to Tony. "She's your responsibility now," he said, his tone grave, as he pulled out his pocket knife. Tony nodded, understanding it was more than a responsibility he was just given, but an unspoken command, not by his captain, but by a lifelong friend in need. As they sprinted down the hall, John's heart sank as a sound emerged from the shadows ahead. More footsteps, dozens, maybe more, thundered toward them, the noise amplifying with each passing second, resonating through the narrow metallic hallway like the beating of a war drum. John skidded to a halt, with his hand shooting up to stop the others. "Hold up!" he hissed, his ears straining to pick up every detail. The footsteps ahead were unmistakable, a horde advancing to cut off their escape. Panic flickered across the crew's faces, but John's voice cut through the fear like a knife. "Let me make this clear. We're not here to harm any of these people, but we are not going back in a cell or under the chopping block without a fight." Todd yelled and tossed the shotgun to John. "Here, you're gonna need this," he said, pulling out his own knife and flipping it open with a flick of his wrist as he took up a stance beside John. They were trapped, nowhere to run, with the sound of footsteps closing in from both sides. The hallway seemed to shrink around them, the pulsing lights now a sickly rhythm that matched the pounding of their hearts. The crew instinctively circled up, with their backs to each other, forming a tight defensive line in the hallway with no place to go. Every breath was shallow, every muscle tense, ready to spring into action. The air was thick with tension, the cold, sterile scent of the facility mixing with the sweat of fear. The footsteps grew louder, with the echoes bouncing off the metallic walls, creating a cacophony that seemed to come from every direction. Time slowed to a crawl, with each second stretching out as they braced themselves for what was about to come. The dim light flickered, casting shadows that seemed to dance with a malevolent intent as the sound of boots against steel filled the space, growing louder and louder until the noise was all-consuming. John tightened his grip on the shotgun, his knuckles white, as he whispered to his crew, "Get ready. This is it." The enemy was upon them, the moment of truth just heartbeats away, and they all knew that this could be their last stand. No more running, no more hiding. They would either fight their way to freedom or go down in a blaze of defiance. This is not goodbye, nor the end. Until the story continues, my friends. B.N.Rocker.